Marcus Thompson had always been a man who walked alone through life. At 32, he carried the weight of countless battles on his shoulders, both literal and metaphorical. His weathered hands told stories of survival, and his piercing blue eyes held secrets that most people would never understand. After serving 15 years in special forces across 3 different countries, Marcus had finally returned to his small hometown of Cedar Falls, hoping to find something he had never really experienced before: peace. The town hadn't changed much since he left as a rebellious 17-year-old. The same old diner still served coffee that could wake the dead, and Mrs. Henderson still gossiped from her front porch about everyone who passed by. But Marcus wasn't the same person who had left all those years ago. The boy who had dreamed of adventure and glory had returned, as a man who had seen too much darkness and craved nothing more than simplicity. He had purchased a small farmhouse on the outskirts of town with his savings. The property came with 20 acres of overgrown land and a barn that had seen better days, but it was exactly what Marcus needed. For the first time in his adult life, he could wake up without wondering if it might be his last day. No more midnight missions, no more life or death decisions, no more watching good men die for causes that sometimes seemed unclear. As autumn painted the countryside in brilliant oranges and reds, Marcus threw himself into renovating his new home. He replaced broken windows, fixed the leaky roof, and slowly brought the old farmhouse back to life. His neighbors were curious about the quiet man who had moved into the old Peterson place, but Marcus kept to himself. He nodded politely when he went to town for supplies, but he didn't engage in small talk or share stories about where he had been. The truth was, Marcus had a plan. He wanted to settle down, maybe start a family. After years of temporary relationships and brief encounters in foreign countries, he longed for something real and lasting. In his mind, he pictured the perfect wife, young, innocent, maybe someone who had grown up in a small town like Cedar Falls, someone who hadn't been touched by the ugliness of the world, someone pure and gentle who could help him forget the things he had seen and done. He imagined teaching her about the world, protecting her from its harsh realities, and building a life together that was the complete opposite of everything he had known as a soldier. She would have long hair that caught the sunlight, a laugh that could chase away his darkest memories, and eyes that looked at him with admiration rather than the fear or respect he was used to seeing from his former comrades. Marcus began frequenting the local church, hoping to meet someone who fit his ideal. He attended community events and even volunteered at the annual Harvest Festival, all while keeping an eye out for the woman who would complete his vision of a peaceful life. The local mothers tried to introduce him to their daughters, and several young women showed interest in the mysterious newcomer, but none of them felt right to Marcus. They seemed too eager, too aware of his military background, too interested in the stories he refused to tell. Meanwhile, the townspeople gradually accepted his presence. The hardware store owner appreciated that Marcus always paid in cash and never haggled over prices. The librarian enjoyed recommending books about farming and home repair to someone who actually read them. Even Mrs. Henderson began to view him favorably after he helped her carry groceries during a particularly windy day. As winter approached, Marcus felt increasingly restless despite his comfortable routine. The farmhouse was nearly finished, his bank account was healthy, and he had established a quiet rhythm of life that should have satisfied him. But something was missing. The perfect woman he had imagined remained elusive, and he began to wonder if his expectations were unrealistic. Late one evening, as he sat by his fireplace reading a book about sustainable farming, a fierce storm began to develop outside. The wind howled through the trees and rain started pelting against his windows with increasing intensity. Marcus checked the weather forecast on his phone and saw warnings about severe thunderstorms that could last through the night. He secured the shutters and made sure his generator was ready in case the power went out. Living alone had taught him to be prepared for anything, and storms didn't worry him the way they might concern other people. He had weathered much worse conditions in places where backup power and warm shelter weren't available. But as the storm intensified, Marcus began to feel an odd sense of anticipation. Something about this particular night felt different, as if the universe was preparing to shift his carefully ordered world in a direction he couldn't predict. He found himself standing at the window, watching the lightning illuminate the countryside in brief, dramatic flashes, The road that passed by his property was usually empty after dark, especially during bad weather, so when he saw headlights moving slowly through the storm, Marcus paid attention. The vehicle seemed to be struggling against the wind, weaving slightly as it fought to stay on the road. Marcus watched with growing concern as the car approached the curve near his driveway. Then everything changed in an instant. A particularly strong gust of wind hit, just as the driver tried to navigate the curve, and the car slid off the road, crashing into the ditch that bordered Marcus's property. The headlights went out immediately, leaving only the intermittent lightning to reveal the outline of the overturned vehicle. Marcus didn't hesitate. He grabbed his heavy coat, a flashlight, and a first aid kit before running out into the storm. The rain soaked through his clothes within seconds, and the wind threatened to knock him off balance, but he pressed forward toward the wreckage. His military training kicked in automatically, his mind shifting into emergency mode as he assessed the situation and prepared to help whoever was trapped inside. As he reached the car, Marcus could see that it was a small sedan, probably 10 years old, with out-of-state license plates. The driver's side was pinned against the ground, but the passenger side was accessible. Through the cracked window, he could make out a figure slumped over the steering wheel. He couldn't tell if the person was conscious or even alive, but he knew he had to act quickly. The storm raged around them as Marcus worked to reach the trapped driver, unaware that this moment would change everything he thought he wanted from life. The innocent, sheltered wife he had been seeking was about to be replaced by something far more complex and challenging than he had ever imagined. Marcus fought against the storm as he reached the overturned car, his flashlight cutting through the darkness to reveal the extent of the damage. The vehicle had rolled once before sliding into the ditch, and steam rose from the crumpled hood where the engine had been damaged. He could smell gasoline mixing with the rain, which added urgency to his rescue efforts. Through the passenger window, he could see the driver more clearly now. It was a woman, probably in her late 20s, with dark hair that had fallen across her face. She was unconscious but breathing, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that relieved some of Marcus's immediate concerns. Blood trickled from a small cut on her forehead, but she didn't appear to have any obviously severe injuries. The door was jammed, but Marcus had dealt with worse obstacles during his military service. He used a rock to carefully break the passenger window, clearing away the glass before reaching inside to check the woman's pulse. It was strong and steady, another good sign. Her skin felt cold from the storm, but not dangerously so. Marcus gently brushed the hair away from her face to get a better look at her injuries, and even in the dim light, he could see that she was beautiful. But it wasn't the fresh-faced, innocent beauty he had been imagining in his ideal wife. This woman's face held traces of deep sadness, even in unconsciousness. There were faint lines around her eyes that spoke of tears shed and sleepless nights endured. Her clothes were elegant but wrinkled, suggesting she had been traveling for a long time. Working carefully to avoid causing further injury, Marcus managed to unbuckle her seatbelt and lift her from the car. She was lighter than he expected, and as he carried her toward his house through the raging storm, she stirred slightly in his arms. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, revealing the deepest brown eyes Marcus had ever seen, filled with confusion and pain that went far beyond her physical injuries. "It's okay," he said, having to shout over the wind. "You're safe now. I'm going to take care of you." She tried to say something, but the words were lost in the storm, and she slipped back into unconsciousness before Marcus could make out what she was trying to communicate. He quickened his pace, eager to get her inside where he could properly assess her condition and warm her up. Once inside his farmhouse, Marcus laid the woman on his couch and covered her with warm blankets. The power had gone out just as he had expected, but his fireplace provided both light and heat. He started the generator to power a few essential lights and began examining her injuries more thoroughly. The cut on her forehead was superficial and had already stopped bleeding. She had some bruises on her arms and what looked like the beginning of a black eye, but nothing seemed serious enough to require immediate medical attention. Marcus had field medical training from his military days, and he was confident that her injuries were minor compared to what they could have been. As he cleaned and bandaged her forehead, the woman began to wake up again. This time her eyes stayed open, and she looked around the unfamiliar room with obvious fear and confusion. When her gaze landed on Marcus, she tried to sit up quickly, wincing at the movement. "Please don't be afraid," Marcus said in the calmest voice he could manage. "I'm Marcus Thompson. You crashed in the storm and I brought you inside. You're hurt, but not seriously." The woman studied his face carefully as if trying to determine whether she could trust him. Her eyes were even more striking now that she was fully conscious. But the sadness Marcus had noticed earlier seemed to have deepened. She looked like someone who had been running from something painful. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Cedar Falls, about 20 miles west of the interstate," Marcus replied. "You were driving past my property when the storm hit. Do you remember what happened?" She closed her eyes and pressed her fingers to her temples, clearly struggling to piece together recent events. "I was trying to get to. I was going somewhere." Her voice trailed off and tears began to form in her eyes. "I can't remember exactly. Everything is fuzzy." Marcus recognized the signs of shock and possible mild concussion. "That's normal after an accident," he assured her. "Your memory should come back gradually. What's your name?" "Elena," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Elena Morrison." She looked down at her hands, and Marcus noticed she wasn't wearing a wedding ring, though there was a pale band of skin on her ring finger that suggested she had worn one recently. "Well, Elena, you're welcome to stay here until the storm passes and you're feeling better. I have a spare bedroom upstairs and I can make you something warm to eat." Elena's eyes filled with tears again, but she nodded gratefully. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." As Marcus helped her to the guest room, he couldn't help but notice how she moved with a careful grace that spoke of good breeding and education. Her clothes, despite being wrinkled from travel and the accident, were expensive. The watch on her wrist was designer, and her shoes were Italian leather. This wasn't a small-town girl who had simply been passing through Cedar Falls. Over the next few hours, as the storm continued to rage outside, Elena slowly began to remember fragments of her recent past. She was from Chicago, she told Marcus, and she had been driving for 2 days straight. When he asked what had brought her to this part of the country, her face clouded over and she changed the subject. Marcus made hot soup and tea, and they sat by the fireplace as the wind howled around the house. Elena was polite but guarded, answering his questions about her immediate needs but deflecting any inquiries about her personal life. Marcus respected her privacy, understanding that some stories took time to tell. As the night wore on, Elena's exhaustion became obvious. The combination of her injuries, the shock of the accident, and whatever had been troubling her before she arrived in Cedar Falls had taken a toll. Marcus showed her to the guest room and made sure she had everything she needed for the night. "Thank you again," she said as she stood in the doorway. "I know you don't owe me anything, but you've been incredibly kind." Marcus found himself studying her face in the soft light from the hallway. She was nothing like the innocent young wife he had been hoping to find, but there was something about her that drew him in despite his original plans. The sadness in her eyes made him want to protect her, but in a different way than he had imagined protecting his ideal woman. Elena didn't need someone to shelter her from the world. She needed someone to help her heal from whatever the world had already done to her. "Get some rest," he said gently. "We can figure out what to do about your car in the morning." As Elena closed the guest room door, Marcus returned to the living room and stared into the fire. The storm that had brought this mysterious woman into his life was beginning to weaken, but he had a feeling that the changes it had set in motion were just beginning. Everything he thought he wanted was about to be challenged by what he might actually need. Morning came with an unusual stillness after the violence of the storm. Marcus woke early, as was his habit from years of military service, and found that the power had been restored sometime during the night. Sunlight streamed through his kitchen windows, revealing the aftermath of the storm. Broken tree branches scattered across his property, and Elena's car still sitting crumpled in the ditch like a reminder of how quickly life could change. He started coffee and began preparing breakfast, moving quietly so as not to wake his unexpected guest. The smell of bacon and eggs filled the kitchen, along with fresh biscuits that he had learned to make during his first lonely months in the farmhouse. Cooking had become a form of meditation for Marcus, a way to ground himself in simple, peaceful activities that had nothing to do with conflict or survival. Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway just as Marcus was plating the food. She looked better than she had the night before, though the bruises on her face were more pronounced in the morning light. She had found a way to tame her dark hair into a neat ponytail, and she wore the same clothes from yesterday, which she had obviously tried to straighten and clean. "Good morning," she said, her voice still carrying traces of uncertainty. "I hope you don't mind that I helped myself to your bathroom. I tried to clean up a bit." "Of course," Marcus replied, gesturing toward the table. "Please sit down and eat something. You need to keep your strength up after yesterday." Elena sat down carefully as if her body was still reminding her of the accident. She accepted the plate Marcus offered and began eating with obvious hunger, suggesting she hadn't had a proper meal in some time before the crash. "This is delicious," she said between bites. "I can't remember the last time someone made me breakfast." There was something wistful in her tone that made Marcus curious, but he didn't push for details. Instead, he poured her coffee and took his own seat across from her. In the morning light, he could see Elena more clearly than he had been able to the night before. She was indeed beautiful, but it was a mature beauty marked by experience and loss. Her hands were elegant but showed signs of stress, and she moved with the careful composure of someone who had learned to hold herself together through difficult times. "I called Tommy's auto shop earlier," Marcus said, breaking the comfortable silence. "They'll come out this afternoon to tow your car and give us an estimate on the damage." Elena's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "I should probably call my insurance company, but honestly, I'm not sure it's worth fixing. That car has been through a lot lately." "Were you planning to trade it in anyway?" Marcus asked casually. "Something like that," Elena replied, but her evasive tone suggested there was more to the story. She took a sip of coffee and gazed out the window toward the wreckage. "I suppose I'll need to figure out alternative transportation." Marcus seized the opportunity to learn more about her situation. "Where were you headed when the storm hit? Maybe I can help you figure out the best way to get there." For the first time since she had awakened, Elena's composed facade cracked slightly. Her eyes filled with tears that she quickly tried to blink away, and her hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup. "I was running away," she admitted quietly. "I know that sounds dramatic, but it's the truth. I was driving west with no particular destination in mind, just trying to get as far away from Chicago as possible." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle. "What were you running from?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, as if she had been holding them back for too long. "My husband died 6 months ago," she said. "David was—" "He was everything to me. We met in college, got married right after graduation, and spent 8 years building this perfect life together. He was a lawyer. I taught high school English. And we had this beautiful house in the suburbs with a garden and plans for children." Marcus stayed silent, sensing that Elena needed to tell her story without interruption. "David had a heart attack at his office on a Tuesday afternoon," she continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "He was only 31 years old, completely healthy as far as we knew. The doctor said it was a genetic condition that no one had detected. One minute I was planning what to make for dinner, and the next minute I was a widow." The pain in Elena's voice was so raw that Marcus felt his own chest tighten with sympathy. He had lost friends in combat, but he couldn't imagine the devastation of losing a life partner so suddenly and unexpectedly. "After David died, everyone expected me to grieve properly and then move on," Elena said, wiping her eyes with the napkin Marcus quietly handed her. "His parents wanted me to stay close to them. My parents thought I should move back home, and my friends kept trying to set me up on dates because they thought it would help me heal. But I couldn't handle being around all those memories and expectations anymore. So you decided to leave," Marcus said, understanding beginning to dawn. "I sold the house, quit my job, and put everything I owned into storage except what I could fit in my car," Elena confirmed. "I know it sounds crazy, but I felt like I was suffocating in that life. Everywhere I went, people looked at me with pity or gave me advice about how to move forward. I just wanted to disappear and figure out who I am without David." Marcus nodded slowly. Elena's story was nothing like what he had imagined when he first pictured his ideal wife, but it resonated with something deep in his own experience. He understood the need to escape from a life that no longer felt authentic, the desire to start over somewhere new where no one knew your history. "You're not crazy," he told her firmly. "Sometimes running away is the only way to find yourself again." Elena looked up at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such understanding from a stranger. "Most people think I'm making a huge mistake. They say I'm being selfish or that I'm not honoring David's memory properly." "Grief doesn't follow other people's timelines," Marcus said, "and neither does healing. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Marcus found himself reassessing everything he thought he had wanted from his new life in Cedar Falls. The innocent, sheltered woman he had been seeking couldn't have understood the weight he carried from his military service. But Elena's experience with loss and trauma created a different kind of connection between them. "What about you?" Elena asked eventually. "What brought you to Cedar Falls? This doesn't seem like the kind of place someone just stumbles upon." Marcus considered how much to reveal. Elena had been honest about her story, and she deserved the same transparency in return. "I was a soldier for 15 years, he said simply. "Special forces deployed all over the world. I came back here because I was tired of violence and wanted to build a peaceful life." Elena studied his face with new interest. "That must have been difficult, transitioning from that kind of life to this one." "Different than I expected," Marcus admitted. "I thought I had it all figured out. I was going to find a nice local girl, get married, maybe start a family, build the kind of normal, quiet life I never had growing up. But it hasn't worked out that way," Elena asked perceptively. Marcus looked out the window at his property, then back at the complex, wounded woman sitting across from him. "Let's just say the storm last night made me realize that maybe I was looking for the wrong things." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Marcus's property as Tommy's tow truck pulled Elena's crumpled car from the ditch. Tommy whistled through his teeth as he examined the damage, shaking his head with the expression of someone who had seen plenty of storm-related accidents over the years. "She's totaled, no question about it," he announced, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "Frames bent, engines shot, and that's just what I can see from here. Insurance company's gonna write this one off for sure." Elena stood beside Marcus, watching her car being loaded onto the truck with a mixture of sadness and relief. That vehicle had carried her away from her old life in Chicago, but it had also been a prison of sorts, keeping her in constant motion when what she really needed was to stop and figure out what came next. "What do you want me to do with it?" Tommy asked. "I can tow it to the junkyard if you want, or hold on to it at my shop until you decide." "The junkyard is fine," Elena said without hesitation. "I won't be needing it anymore." After Tommy left, Elena and Marcus found themselves standing in the sudden quiet of his property, both aware that they had reached a decision point. Elena no longer had transportation, and Marcus could offer her a ride to wherever she wanted to go, but neither of them seemed eager to end their unexpected connection. "I should probably rent a car and find a motel in town," Elena said, though her tone suggested she wasn't enthusiastic about the idea. "You could," Marcus agreed, "but you're welcome to stay here for a few days while you figure out your next move. I have plenty of space, and honestly, I wouldn't mind the company." Elena looked at him carefully as if trying to read his motives. "Are you sure? I'm basically a stranger who crashed into your life, literally. You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not," Marcus said, "but sometimes the best things happen when we help each other without keeping score." Elena's smile was the first genuinely happy expression Marcus had seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. The sadness was still there, but it was joined by something warmer and more hopeful. Over the next few days, an easy routine developed between them. Marcus continued his work on the farmhouse and property, while Elena helped with cooking and cleaning, seeming to find comfort in domestic tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind focused on the present moment rather than dwelling on her loss. They talked while they worked, sharing stories that gradually revealed more about their backgrounds and personalities. Marcus learned that Elena had been an excellent teacher who genuinely loved literature and helping teenagers discover the power of words. She had been working on a novel before David died, but hadn't been able to write anything since losing him. Elena discovered that Marcus had taught himself carpentry, plumbing, and electrical work during his military service, and that he had a surprisingly gentle touch with the stray cats that had adopted his property. She watched him repair a broken window with the same careful precision he probably once used to clean his weapons, and she began to see that his desire for peace wasn't just about avoiding conflict, but about creating something beautiful and lasting. On their fourth evening together, as they sat by the fireplace after dinner, Elena finally asked the question that had been building between them. "What happened to you over there?" she said quietly. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but I can see it in your eyes sometimes. The same look I see in my own mirror." Marcus stared into the fire for a long time before answering. I lost my unit in Afghanistan 3 years ago, he said finally. We were supposed to be on a routine patrol, but we walked into an ambush. I was the only one who made it out. Elena reached over and touched his hand gently. That's why you came home? I couldn't do it anymore, Marcus confirmed. Couldn't make life or death decisions. Couldn't watch any more good people die. Couldn't pretend that I was making the world safer when all I could see was the violence spreading like a disease. I needed to find something clean and simple and real. And you thought that would be a perfect wife and a perfect family, Elena said, understanding in her voice. Seems pretty naive now, Marcus admitted with a rueful smile. I was looking for someone who could help me forget about the darkness. But maybe what I really need is someone who understands it. They sat in comfortable silence, both processing the weight of what Marcus had shared. Elena's experience with sudden, devastating loss wasn't the same as Marcus's trauma from war, but they both understood what it felt like to have their fundamental assumptions about life shattered without warning. Can I ask you something? Elena said eventually. Marcus nodded. When you imagined your perfect wife, did you think about what you could offer her in return? Or were you mostly focused on what she could give you? The question hit Marcus harder than he had expected. He realized that in all his fantasies about finding an innocent, sheltered woman to marry, he had primarily thought about what she could do for him. Provide peace, give him children, help him feel normal and clean again. He hadn't spent nearly as much time considering what kind of husband he could be to someone who had never experienced loss or trauma. You're right, he said after a moment. I was being selfish. I wanted someone to save me from my own experiences, but I wasn't thinking about what that would mean for her. I don't think you were being selfish, Elena said gently. I think you were trying to heal in the only way you knew how. But maybe healing isn't about forgetting or escaping from what happened to us. Maybe it's about learning to live with our experiences in a way that doesn't define us completely. Marcus looked at Elena with new appreciation. Despite her own pain, she was able to see his situation with clarity and compassion. She wasn't trying to fix him or change him, but she was helping him understand himself better. What about you? Marcus asked. What did you think you were looking for when you left Chicago? Elena considered the question seriously. I thought I was looking for a place where I could disappear and start over completely. Somewhere no one would know about David or expect me to be the person I was when he was alive. But now I'm wondering if that was just another form of running away. Maybe, Marcus said, but sometimes you have to run away from something before you can figure out what you're running toward. Elena smiled at that, and Marcus realized that her smiles were becoming more frequent and more genuine as the days passed. The deep sadness in her eyes was still there, but it was no longer the only emotion he could see in her face. I've been thinking about something, Elena said, her voice becoming more thoughtful. Before David died, I never really had to be strong on my own. He was the one who handled difficult decisions and protected me from life's complications. In some ways, I was exactly the kind of innocent, sheltered woman you thought you wanted. Marcus waited for her to continue. But losing him forced me to become someone different, someone who could survive devastating loss and still keep going, someone who could make hard choices about leaving behind everything familiar. I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago, and I don't think I'd want to go back to being her even if I could. You've become stronger, Marcus observed. Yes, but not in the way I expected. I thought strength meant not crying or not admitting how much I was hurting. But real strength, I think, is being able to face the pain honestly and still believe that life can be good again. As the evening grew later, Marcus found himself looking at Elena with completely different eyes than he had used to envision his ideal wife. She wasn't innocent or sheltered, but she was real and complex and brave in ways he was only beginning to understand. More importantly, she seemed to see him clearly too, without trying to change him into someone more comfortable or conventional. A week into Elena's stay at the farmhouse, the reality of their situation began to settle in around them like morning mist. They had fallen into such a natural rhythm of shared meals, conversation, and quiet companionship that it was easy to forget this arrangement was supposed to be temporary. But Elena's bruises were healing, her memories of the accident had returned completely, and she was clearly strong enough to continue her journey if she chose to do so. Neither of them mentioned her departure directly, but it hung in the air between them like an unfinished sentence. Marcus caught himself paying extra attention to small details, the way Elena hummed while she cooked, How she curled up in the corner of his couch with a book, the sound of her laughter when he told stories about his more ridiculous military experiences. He was memorizing these moments without consciously admitting to himself why. Elena, for her part, found herself studying Marcus with the same intensity. She watched how carefully he repaired things around the house, never cutting corners or settling for temporary solutions. She noticed how gently he treated the stray animals that wandered onto his property, and how he always seemed to have cash in his pocket for Girl Scout cookies or church fundraisers when they went to town together. These weren't the behaviors of the hardened warrior she might have expected from his military background, but rather those of a man who was consciously choosing kindness and generosity as a way of being in the world. The turning point came on a Thursday afternoon when they drove to the next town over to run errands. Elena needed to replace some personal items that had been damaged in the crash, and Marcus wanted to pick up supplies for a new project he was starting in his barn. As they walked through the small downtown area together, Elena realized that people were beginning to notice them as a couple. "Your young man seems very attentive," commented the elderly woman behind the counter at the pharmacy where Elena was buying toiletries. "Oh, we're not," Elena started to correct her, then found herself unsure how to explain their relationship. What exactly were they to each other? Marcus handled the situation smoothly, simply smiling politely and steering the conversation toward the weather. But Elena could feel the weight of the unasked questions between them as they continued their shopping. Later, as they sat in a small cafe sharing coffee and pie, Elena finally brought up what they had both been avoiding. "People think we're together," she said, stirring her coffee unnecessarily. "Does that bother you?" Marcus asked, his tone carefully neutral. Elena considered the question seriously. A month ago, the idea of people assuming she was with another man would have felt like a betrayal of David's memory. She had expected to spend years, maybe the rest of her life, identifying primarily as his widow. But something had shifted during her time with Marcus. 6 months ago it would have, she admitted. But now, I don't know. It feels different than I expected. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Different how?" "When David and I were together, we were like two halves of the same person. We finished each other's sentences, liked all the same things, never really disagreed about anything important. It was comfortable and safe, but looking back, I wonder if we ever really challenged each other to grow." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "With you, I feel like I'm discovering parts of myself I never knew existed. You don't try to protect me from difficult conversations or complex emotions. You treat me like I'm strong enough to handle the truth about things." Marcus felt something shift in his chest at her words. "You are strong enough. Stronger than you probably realize." "That's exactly what I mean," Elena said, leaning forward. "David would have tried to shield me from painful realities. You helped me face them head on." They sat in contemplative silence for a while, both processing what Elena had revealed. Finally, Marcus spoke. "I need to tell you something," he said. "When I first saw you in that car, I thought the universe was playing some kind of joke on me. You were nothing like what I thought I wanted, and I almost resented having my neat little plan disrupted." Elena smiled. "Just almost?" "But then I got to know you," Marcus continued, "and I realized that what I thought I wanted was actually what I was afraid I needed. I wanted someone innocent because I was ashamed of the things I'd seen and done. I wanted someone sheltered because I didn't trust myself to be worthy of someone who had choices. And now?" Elena prompted gently. "Now I think maybe the storm didn't just bring you to me by accident. Maybe it brought us to each other because we both needed to learn that healing doesn't mean forgetting who we've been. It means accepting all the broken and beautiful parts of ourselves and finding someone who can love us anyway." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, but they weren't the desperate tears of grief she had grown accustomed to. These were different, softer somehow. "Marcus, I care about you more than I thought I could care about anyone again. But I'm scared." "What are you scared of?" he asked, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I'm scared that I'm using you as an escape from my grief instead of dealing with it properly. I'm scared that you're attracted to my brokenness because it matches your own. And that's not a healthy foundation for anything real. And I'm terrified that if we try to build something together, I'll lose you too. And I don't think I could survive that kind of loss again." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "Those are all valid fears," he said. "I have some of my own. I'm scared that I don't know how to be in a relationship with someone who's my equal, instead of someone I think I need to protect. I'm scared that my nightmares and flashbacks will eventually drive you away. And I'm scared that I'm being selfish again, wanting you to stay because being with you makes me feel more human than I've felt in years." They looked at each other across the small table, both vulnerable in a way that neither had expected to be again. The cafe bustled around them with the ordinary business of a small-town afternoon, but they felt suspended in a moment that would define the direction of both their lives. "So where does that leave us?" Elena asked quietly. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then smiled with a mixture of nervousness and determination. "It leaves us with a choice. We can play it safe and you can continue your journey west, and I can go back to looking for someone who fits my original plan. We'll both wonder what might have been, but we won't risk getting hurt again. Or," Elena prompted, "or we can acknowledge that we're both damaged and healing and imperfect and see if we can build something real together anyway, not because we're trying to escape from our pasts, but because we've learned from them. Not because we think the other person will fix us, but because we've figured out how to fix ourselves and want to share that strength with someone else." Elena stared at their joined hands on the table, thinking about the woman she had been 6 months ago and the woman she was becoming. The old Elena would have been too afraid to take such a risk, too dependent on guarantees and certainties. But grief had taught her that there were no guarantees in life, and that the only real choice was between living fully or hiding from the possibility of pain. "I want to try," she said finally, looking up to meet his eyes. "I want to stay. Not because I'm running away from my old life anymore, but because I want to build a new one." "With you?" Marcus felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't even realized had been tight. "Are you sure? Because once we do this, once we really commit to figuring this out together, there's no going back to the way things were." Elena laughed, and the sound was lighter than any laugh Marcus had heard from her before. "Marcus, I drove my car into a ditch in a storm and ended up falling for a former soldier who makes the world's best biscuits and treats stray cats like honored guests. I think it's safe to say that my life already can't go back to the way things were." As they walked back to Marcus's truck, hand in hand for the first time, both of them felt the peculiar mixture of excitement and terror that comes with making a leap of faith. They weren't the people they had been when the storm brought them together, and they weren't the people they thought they wanted to become. They were something entirely new. Two individuals who had learned to be whole on their own, and were choosing to share that wholeness with each other. The drive home was filled with comfortable conversation about practical things. How they would handle Elena's mail forwarding, where they would put her belongings when they arrived from storage, whether the guest room should become a home office or if Elena wanted to move her things into Marcus's room. These mundane details felt revolutionary to both of them, proof that they were really doing this, really choosing to build a life together. As they pulled into the driveway of the farmhouse, Elena looked at the property with new eyes. This wasn't just Marcus's place anymore, or a temporary refuge from her grief. This was home, the place where she would continue becoming whoever she was meant to be, alongside a man who understood that love wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about being brave enough to keep growing, even when growing was scary. 3 months after Elena officially decided to stay in Cedar Falls, their relationship had settled into something that surprised them both with its depth and authenticity. Elena had moved her belongings from Chicago storage into the farmhouse, transforming the space from a bachelor's refuge into a true home, shared by two people who were learning to love again. The guest room had become Elena's writing space, filled with her books and a small desk where she had finally begun working on her novel again. The story that emerged was different from what she had been writing before David's death. Instead of the light romantic comedy she had originally planned, she found herself crafting a story about resilience, about how people could find unexpected strength in the aftermath of loss. Marcus often found her there in the evenings, typing steadily while soft music played from her laptop, and he learned to recognize the particular expression of concentration she wore when the words were flowing well. Marcus had also changed in ways that went beyond simply sharing his space. Elena's presence had encouraged him to reconnect with parts of himself that he had thought were lost forever. He started attending the weekly poker game at the fire station, began helping coach a youth baseball team in town, and even accepted an invitation to speak at the high school about military service and the challenges of coming home. Elena's belief in his fundamental goodness helped him see himself as more than just a collection of combat. experiences and survival instincts. They had developed their own rhythms and traditions that felt natural rather than forced. Saturday mornings were for working on house projects together, with Elena learning basic carpentry skills and Marcus discovering that he enjoyed having an enthusiastic apprentice. Sunday afternoons meant long walks around the property, planning future improvements and discussing their dreams for how the place might look in 5 or 10 years. But perhaps most importantly, they had learned to navigate the difficult moments together. Elena still had days when grief for David would wash over her unexpectedly, leaving her quiet and withdrawn. Marcus still experienced nightmares and periods of hypervigilance that reminded them both of the war's lasting impact on his psyche. Rather than trying to fix each other or pretend these challenges didn't exist, they had developed a quiet understanding about when to offer comfort and when to simply provide space. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Elena brought up a topic they had been dancing around for weeks. "Marcus," she said, setting down her glass of lemonade, "what do you think about us getting married?" Marcus nearly choked on his own drink, not because the question was unwelcome, but because Elena had always been the more cautious one about making their relationship official. "Are you proposing to me?" he asked with a grin. "Maybe I am," Elena replied, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "I know it's not very traditional, but then again, nothing about us has been traditional." Marcus set down his glass and turned to face her fully. "What made you start thinking about it?" Elena was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I was talking to my sister on the phone yesterday, and she asked me when I was going to stop playing house and either commit to you or come home to Chicago. At first I was angry at her for not understanding, but then I realized she had a point." "She did?" Marcus asked, curious about Elena's reasoning. "Not the way she meant it," Elena clarified. "But I realized that I've been holding back from fully committing to this life we're building because I was afraid it would somehow diminish what I had with David. Like loving you completely would mean I was betraying his memory." Marcus nodded, understanding the complexity of Elena's feelings about her first marriage. "But then I thought about what David would actually want for me," Elena continued. "He loved me, truly loved me, and if he were here he would want me to be happy. He would want me to have a full life, even if it was different from the one we had planned together." "And what do you want?" Marcus asked gently. "I want to marry you," Elena said simply. "Not because I'm trying to replace what I lost, but because what we have is worth celebrating and protecting and making official. I want to be your wife, and I want you to be my husband, and I want everyone to know that we chose each other deliberately and completely." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. In all his fantasies about finding a wife, he had never imagined a proposal that would move him as much as Elena's straightforward declaration of love and commitment. "Yes," he said, reaching for her hands. "Absolutely yes. But I have one condition." Elena raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Let me propose to you properly," Marcus said. "I know you just proposed to me and I loved it, but I've been carrying around my grandmother's ring for 2 months waiting for the right moment. Can we pretend this conversation never happened so I can do this the way I've been planning?" Elena laughed, the bright, joyful sound that Marcus had come to treasure above all others. "You've been planning to propose?" "I bought the ring the week after you decided to stay," Marcus confessed. "I knew it was fast, but I also knew it was right. I just wanted to wait until I was sure you felt the same way." "Well, now you know I do," Elena said, leaning over to kiss him softly. "But yes, you can propose to me properly. I promise to act surprised." The next evening, Marcus suggested they take a walk to the spot where Elena's car had crashed during the storm. It had become a special place for them, the exact location where their lives had intersected and changed forever. Marcus had planted wildflowers there in the spring, turning what could have been a reminder of trauma into something beautiful. As they stood among the blooming flowers in the soft evening light, Marcus got down on one knee and pulled out a small velvet box. "Elena Morrison," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. 6 months ago, a storm brought you into my life and changed everything I thought I knew about love and partnership and what it means to build a life with someone. You've taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting our past, but learning to carry it with grace. You've shown me that strength comes not from protecting ourselves from pain, but from being brave enough to love deeply despite the risk." Elena felt tears streaming down her cheeks as Marcus opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring. I'm not the man I thought I was when I moved to Cedar Falls. And you're not the woman you were when you left Chicago. But together, we've become people we never could have been alone. Will you marry me? Yes, Elena said, dropping to her knees in front of him so they were eye to eye. Yes, I will marry you, Marcus Thompson. I will love you and challenge you and build a beautiful life with you. And I will never take for granted the storm that brought us together. As Marcus slipped the ring onto Elena's finger, they both felt the profound rightness of the moment. This wasn't the fairy tale ending either of them had once imagined, but it was something better, a real beginning, grounded in mutual respect, shared strength, and the kind of love that comes from truly seeing and accepting another person completely. 2 years after their engagement, Marcus and Elena stood in the same wildflower patch where he had proposed. But this time, they were surrounded by family and friends who had gathered to witness their wedding. The ceremony was small and intimate, held on a perfect autumn afternoon when the leaves were just beginning to turn gold and the air carried the promise of winter's rest and renewal. Elena wore a simple cream-colored dress that she had chosen specifically because it felt like her, not like someone she used to be or thought she should become. Her hair was swept back in a low bun decorated with small wildflowers from their property, and she carried a bouquet of the same flowers that Marcus had planted at the crash site. She looked radiant, but more than that, she looked peacefully happy in a way that spoke of deep contentment rather than temporary joy. Marcus had surprised everyone by how emotional he became during the ceremony. The man who had once prided himself on maintaining control in even the most dangerous situations found himself wiping away tears as Elena spoke her vows. She had written them herself, and her words about choosing to love bravely despite life's uncertainties moved everyone present, including Marcus's former military brothers who had never seen their composed friend so openly moved. Marcus, Elena said, her voice strong and clear despite her own tears, when I was running away from everything I had lost, I thought I was looking for a place to disappear. Instead, I found a person who helped me discover who I really am. You've taught me that love isn't about being safe from pain, but about finding someone worth facing life's challenges beside. Marcus's vows were shorter, but no less heartfelt. Elena, you crashed into my life during a storm and you've been my calm ever since. Not because you've made everything easy, but because you've made everything worth it. I promise to love all of you, your strength and your vulnerability, your past and your future, your questions as much as your answers. The reception was held in Marcus's newly renovated barn, which Elena had helped transform into a warm, welcoming space perfect for community gatherings. Local musicians provided entertainment. Mrs. Henderson from down the road had insisted on making her famous apple pie for dessert. And Tommy from the auto shop gave a surprisingly touching toast about how some of the best things in life come from the worst moments. Elena's parents had flown in from California, where they had moved after retiring. Her mother had initially been skeptical about Elena's choice to marry someone she had known for such a short time, but meeting Marcus in person had won her over completely. He looks at you like you're the most interesting person in the room, she told Elena while they were getting ready that morning. That's how your father still looks at me after 35 years. Marcus's military friends had made the trip from various parts of the country, and their presence meant more to him than he had expected. These were men who had seen him at his lowest points, who understood what it had cost him to build this peaceful life, and their genuine happiness for his new beginning felt like a benediction on everything he had overcome. But perhaps the most moving moment of the day came during the dancing. The DJ had just played the song Marcus and Elena had chosen for their first dance as husband and wife, and as the music shifted to something more upbeat, Elena noticed an older man sitting alone at one of the tables. He was well-dressed but seemed uncomfortable, as if he wasn't sure he belonged at the celebration. Who is that? Elena asked Marcus, nodding discreetly toward the man. Marcus followed her gaze and his expression softened. That's Tom Peterson, the man who owned our house before I bought it. His wife died last year and he doesn't have any family left. I invited him because I thought he might like to see what we've done with the place, but I think he might be feeling a bit out of place. Without hesitation, Elena walked over to Tom's table and extended her hand. Mr. Peterson, I'm Elena. Would you do me the honor of dancing with the bride? The old man's face lit up with surprise and pleasure. As Elena led him onto the dance floor, she noticed that several other guests began including him in their conversations, and by the end of the evening, Tom was laughing and sharing stories about the farmhouse's history with anyone who would listen. "That was beautiful," Marcus told Elena later as they were cleaning up. "The way you made sure he felt included." "It's what David would have done," Elena said simply. "And it's what you would have done if you had noticed him sitting alone. We take care of each other, don't we? That's what community means." As their guests gradually departed and they finished putting the barn back in order, Marcus and Elena found themselves alone on their front porch, still in their wedding clothes but barefoot, sharing a final glass of champagne as they watched the stars emerge in the clear night sky. "So," Marcus said, pulling Elena closer to his side, "how does it feel to be Mrs. Thompson?" Elena considered the question seriously. "It feels like coming home," she said. "Not in the sense of returning to something I lost, but in the sense of finally arriving somewhere I belong." They sat in comfortable silence, both reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Elena thought about the woman she had been when she first drove away from Chicago, desperate and lost and convinced that her capacity for happiness had died with David. She could never have imagined then that grief could actually expand a person's ability to love, rather than diminish it, or that healing could create space for new kinds of joy without erasing the importance of what had been lost. Marcus thought about his original plan to find an innocent young wife who would help him forget about his experiences as a soldier. He realized now how impossible and unfair that expectation had been, both to himself and to any woman who might have tried to fulfill that role. Elena hadn't helped him forget anything, but she had helped him integrate his experiences into a fuller understanding of who he was and who he could become. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if there hadn't been a storm that night?" Elena asked. "Sometimes," Marcus admitted, "but then I remember that we both needed to be exactly who we were, in exactly the circumstances we were in, to be ready for what we found together. If we had met earlier when you were still married and I was still looking for someone to rescue me from myself, it never would have worked." Elena nodded, understanding what he meant. "We had to be broken first, didn't we? So we could learn how to be whole on our own. And then choose to share that wholeness with each other," Marcus agreed. As they finally headed inside to begin their first night as husband and wife, both Marcus and Elena carried with them a deep sense of gratitude, not just for finding each other, but for the difficult experiences that had shaped them into people capable of building something real and lasting together. The storm that had brought them together had long since passed, but its effects would ripple through their lives forever. A reminder that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our stories begin in the moments when everything seems to be falling apart. Their farmhouse, which had started as Marcus's refuge and become Elena's sanctuary, was now truly their home. A place where two people who had learned to weather life's storms alone had discovered the joy of facing whatever came next together. And in the years that followed, they would indeed face challenges and changes, losses and celebrations, but they would meet them all with the quiet confidence of two people who had found in each other not a shelter from life's difficulties, but a partner worthy of sharing them with.